Okay, right, so some themes that we've already heard of I'll talk about. I should say, for people who don't know me, I have a day job which involves me coordinating research for the UK Energy Research Centre. But when I'm feeling creative and reflective, I write, so still find time to do that. And this sort of paper, there is a paper, if people want the paper, please do email me. It's actually under review, so I didn't want to disseminate it too far and wide. Okay, so what am I going to talk about? Right, this is a kind of personal exercise in reflection for me, partly. So, bridging between my sort of day job and thinking about innovation theory and also innovation practice. Bridging between disciplines. So UKIP, of course, along with transition pathways and other things, is charged with being whole systems in its outlook. But it also means that I'm endogenizing theory making into that process, so I'm trying to be reflective about theory making. And what I know really about is innovation theory rather than I come at this as an innovation theorist coming out of technology studies originally. So I've been thinking about things like multi-level perspective and technological innovation systems theory for quite a long time. I'm thinking about how those have played out or not played out in more recent work that I've done. So revisiting some old debates in technology studies on the basis of that. Okay, so my hypothesis to set up the paper and try and make it a bit more interesting is that innovation theory for energy needs remaking. So the terms of energy system change have changed quite dramatically over the last 5 years through all kinds of pressures, the intensity of the pressures, but also the context about financial crisis, debt recovery, emphasis on growth, government. I don't think that's been properly picked up in innovation theory for energy, and that's my kind of challenge to people around the table today. So I think we need renewal in our theories. I think we need to endogenize theory in a way that we're tending to see the changing system through exogenous theory. So how do we think about that? I use the term accelerated innovation. I think those pressures are changing a bit from even 3-4 years ago. So I think we're less ambitious about acceleration than we used to be. Probably when I first started writing about stuff, it was an easier characterization to make. The paper and presentation does a bit of tracing of some energy world as I see it, and then sort of parallel story about theory making around that. Consider resonances and dissonances between policy and theory, and then try and sharpen up some implications. I should say that hasn't gone very far, so partly this is problematizing rather than solutionizing, as I was once told. So I'm very happy to engage in this. So the first bit is to think just how remarkably things have changed, actually. So in another paper I'm looking at UK Energy Innovation System, so this is pretty familiar stuff. So innovation used in quite a conventional sense. So this is the IEA public database that we've all got access to. So the scales aren't the same on the graph. This is the whole of IEA Europe, this is the UK. And the main thing is that the UK has gone from quite an extreme don't do innovation, or don't do RD&D, technical spending I guess, to let's catch up to the rest of Europe. So that by the end of this one, certainly by 2011, UK is on an IEA average now for its public spending. And it will also change in its composition. So we start to see again, quite dramatically, suddenly attention being given to energy efficiency and to renewables, and that whole story of dominance of nuclear has kind of gone away in terms of RD&D spend. So in the paper I developed that into a narrative. I break the recent as a kind of narrative convenience, break that down. This is all quite familiar for people, so there's no need to really go on about that. That infrastructure disappeared, so we're remaking the infrastructure, and it's happened in a fragmented way. That's one of the observations is that we still have a lot of institutional fragmentation within the energy programme and beyond, and so on. And so what we had at the beginnings of this process of remaking was energy innovation in the niches or in the margins. I'm sure niches is particularly helpful in this context, but it's certainly a marginal effort in the early part of the last decade. And we saw a process of momentum building, which was still under benign or supportive wider economic conditions, but also, as people have already referred to, this kind of the rise of security and later on cost concerns. But there was a kind of healthy momentum about that. The other things that started to happen was that the private sector began to become very important in not only the kind of recipient of funds, but also in the strategic priorities that were being set. So the stuff that Frank talked about, these big technologies came back onto the picture. And then, sort of the most recent period that, I think it's quite problematic simply to say acceleration now, but anyway, so we saw a kind of step change in targets and the resources and the kind of ambitions of the energy system. These huge short-term targets, which have a lot of implications for the nature of innovation, so a concentration on I think Ronan refers to this, so this is from the Carbon Plan. The aim of the innovation system to some extent is to get out of the way, to create a level playing field, or allow a level playing field to be created. And that will happen in the 2020s. These technologies will all be sort of subsidy free by then, markets can return. So that's quite an interesting idea of what energy innovation is about, as a dominant definition. And then this regime reinforcement, which comes out of some of the statements, but also a lot of the practice. So we do not believe that decentralised community energy systems can lead to significant replacement of large-scale infrastructure. Setting up the EMR kind of levels of spending, there is no reasonable alternative. To give an example of Frank's interesting statement, reinvestment in a centralised system. So that's setting the scene for EMR. I want to say something about theory. So I want to pose theory as part of this this kind of problem. Right. So if I read around what are the presumptions of theoretical kind of development in this field, of course there is this kind of image which is really interesting of a dance floor where practice, policy, research and theory are dancing partners. And at different times, different parts of that exchange can be driving. How does that work in practice? So, sustainable energy innovation theory. I think what we've seen is over the period that I've been looking at this, we've seen the rise of things like multi-level perspective. Frank traces this lineage quite clearly back to social constructivism and technology studies. So that the framing that develops out of that is that regimes generate incremental innovations, radical innovations generated in niches. Okay? System innovation starts in niches. Now I know there's a lot of literature engaging about this, and I don't want to rehearse it too much. But I did want to say that there's old debates about Scott, particularly social constructivism. The fact that the analytical lens is then drawn towards the early stages of radical technology projects, ignoring the greater part of technological change, where incremental changes proceed in the context of already strongly articulated social economic interests. It goes back a long way, these debates. Then there's a remaking of, or a kind of development of NLP over the last few years. These are all quite familiar things to most of the people around the table, so again, there's no point to go over those. But I think some of Frank's more recent writings are quite interesting in terms of reflecting these changes. So, sorry Frank, I happen to be talking about you while you're in the room, and this wasn't intended to personalise. But so, the MRP has tended to monolithic accounts of regimes and returning to their internal tensions and conflicts. And also he pointed, Frank, I think, to these other research fields which are now increasingly looking at energy, and I think this is really interesting, and for me this points the way forwards. Also, I mean, on technological innovation systems, there is something in the paper about that and the similarities and the kind of where they come from. This explicit emphasis on macroeconomy rather than institutional infrastructure. And again, you know, Frank's also made his point that there is a tendency to a point source narrative account. So I'm quite interested in thinking about how do we open that up? How do we think about non-radical, non-disruptive versions of system change? And there is a lot of interesting kind of literature on the sidelines about this, about the powerful historical role of incremental innovation at the time, rather less visible. Some interesting reviews. Richard Young's carried out a review of the US Department of Energy spending. We also know that incumbents can be surprisingly agile at different times, so there is a historical kind of some interesting lessons from that, I think. How quickly established commitments can be abandoned under certain circumstances. In the paper I developed this into thinking about alternative framings of system change, niche-led, regime-led and breakthrough. So we just take some readings and use them as kind of characterizations of these different models. So we have the kind of the niche-led framing, which the Maori paper in research policy was a special issue, I think, which was quite an interesting one. That paper caused a bit of discussion in research policy. Some respondents were really quite interesting. We have a continuity-led version of system change given urgency pressures, and this goes back actually to the other room, not before. So this is, again, this has been articulated for quite a long time. And then, sort of less often you hear about this, and less often it's advocated, that Charles Perrow, interestingly, actually calls for a kind of a real centralised top-down approach for things like CCS. So, real kind of Apollo mission type stuff, and then licensing to allow for diffusion. So those things are out there in the literature. I think it's interesting how that's not kind of properly endogenized in energy innovation theory. So I offer up to this meeting a sort of rethinking about that somehow the development of niche-led theory coincided with this period of kind of innovation on the margins. And I think that's changed now. I think the frame, the sort of macroeconomic, macro-social context of that has changed. So accelerated innovation is being mainly regime-led in the UK. What do we do about that in terms of sustainable innovation theory and sustainable energy innovation theory? Well, there are options out there. I think we might think about interpreting this as through a sort of niche-led framing. So it's possible to speculate about this as being the first phase of a sequence of transition types, in that sense, in the writing, regime overthrow to follow on. Or actually, we might think about developing and sort of making more visible, more structural institutional framings. And I've seen already today in some of the talks that's beginning to happen. So I'm looking for a richer, more nuanced account of regimes, the prospects of these different versions of the future, continuity-led, disruptive in different ways, either niche or breakthrough. Those dynamics need teasing out for me. I would like to, some of the more interesting papers that I've read recently have come from quite likely sources in terms of people who disciplines which weren't really looking at energy innovation a few years ago, but things like organisational studies, project management, risk, corporate strategy, research features, all now looking at energy innovation in quite a serious way. So I'm not saying we need to sort of abandon our old theories, of course. I'm saying that we need ontological heterogeneity. And I think that's, I'm not the first person to say that, but I think it's quite an important project. I think actually the theory making should be endogenized as part of the research project, so I would hope to see that kind of reflection, explicit reflection in theory, in sort of analytical pieces. So I'm more fully to engage with the varied dynamics of not just regime-led actually, but different forms of system change. I think that also means kind of digging at some of our old theories of technology innovation studies.